So we've regripped clubs, we've shortened clubs, we've extended clubs, and we've removed graphite and steel shafts. Now we can put all that together and assemble a club. Let's go. Hi everyone, it's AJ, the Mobile Club Maker. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoy it, please go down below as always, like it, send it to a friend, or subscribe to our channel. Today, we're going to talk about assembling a golf club. That being, we're going to take this head, this shaft, and this grip, put them together into a functional golf club. I'm going to show you how to do it, the tools you're going to need, and any tips and tricks I can offer. First, let's talk about the tools you're going to need. The tools you're going to need for this project: grip tape, grip solvent, a vice clamp. We'll also need 2-part epoxy and also a measuring stick to measure the club. Okay, next let's talk about prepping your pieces for assembly. We'll start off with the head. I've already gone, as you can see, and removed the shaft from this head. You basically want to clean out the hosel as best you can so there aren't any little particles left in it of old epoxy. You can clean it out with our sandpaper drill. You can clean it out with a wire brush. Finally, if there's any little bits left in there, I'll take a little acetone, pour it into a little container, and basically just take a Q-tip, dip it in the acetone, and run it around inside the hosel. That basically breaks up any last little bits, gets the inside good and clean. It'll take about, I don't know, 15-20 seconds. Once you're done, that acetone will be completely dry and gone, and you can assemble the club. So that's prepping the head. Next, we're going to prep the shaft. Whenever you're working with shafts, you want to make sure you know the trimming instructions for that shaft. That being, there are 2 ways to cut a shaft. You can cut it from the tip side, the side that goes into the head. That's going to change the flex characteristics, the launch characteristics of it. Then, at the end, you'll cut from the butt end, and that's going to determine the length of the club. This particular shaft does not have any tip trimming when going into a driver. It just goes straight in as is. If you wanted to tip it and make it a little stiffer, you could. We're not going to. We're going to play it just like it is. At this point, if we're not going to tip it, we next need to remove any sort of paint that's sitting on the end of the shaft. I'll show you in this camera. These shafts, actually, they don't finish painting the very end of it because they know it's going to go into a golf club, so it's just going to get stripped off anyway. But there's a little bit extra here that we're going to want to take off. So how do we figure out how much we need to take off? Well, if you can slide it into the head, and if it goes in all the way, you can measure and figure out, okay, that's how far I need to take the paint down. If you can't get it all the way in, sometimes the paint is built up pretty thick on these and you can't slide it into the hosel. What I like to do is just get a measuring stick, a little popsicle stick that I'm going to use for the epoxy later, slide that all the way in, and just kind of mark it with my finger how far into the hosel that goes. So basically right there. Now I can take that and transfer it onto my shaft right there. I'm going to put a tiny little dot, and I want to make it just short of where my finger is because I don't want to get so much paint off that when you assemble the golf club, you have a raw shaft sticking out of the hosel. Won't give you a very clean look. You want to make sure the paint goes all the way down to the bottom of the hosel here. All right, now that we've done that, anytime you're prepping a graphite shaft, cutting a graphite shaft, I always like to use some masking tape. If you're cutting a graphite shaft, I like to wrap the masking tape around the middle of wherever you're going to be cutting so that you're cutting right through the middle of the masking tape. Basically, it just helps ensure that you aren't going to accidentally fray the shaft at all, and any of those carbon fibers are going to get knocked loose while you're cutting it. In this case, in order to make sure that I don't take off too much paint, I'm going to go ahead and just put a roll, oh, I don't know, that's about 3 layers thick of masking tape, just to act as a little buffer. Okay, there's a few different ways you can get this paint off. You can use a little bit of sandpaper and work on it that way. Medium to fine grit, just sort of gentle pressure. You can use a belt sander if you have one. Again, you want to be careful because you don't want to dig into it too hard, as you could then get too far into the graphite and possibly weaken the shaft. Another option is you can take a utility knife. I think we've talked about this in another video. You can take your utility knife and you can scrape the paint off. Now, when you're scraping the paint off, you don't want the blade cutting into the graphite fibers. So you turn the blade basically perpendicular to the shaft, maybe even a little bit beyond that. So the blade is pointing towards me, but I'm going to take it and slide it away. Slide it away. And basically work my way around. And this will take any paint off. And as long as you don't have the blade pointing in the direction that you're scraping, you're not going to damage the shaft. You'll just take the paint off. It just works like a little scraper. This is a method that I like because you know you're never going to go too deep. In some cases, certain shafts like to put a lot of paint on there, and you might need to sand it more versus that method. But you just have to see what shaft you're dealing with, go from there. All right, I'm going to go ahead, sand it just a touch more, and then we'll slide it into the hosel and see if we got it where we need it. Okay. Let's take a little paper towel, just wipe that off. All right, so now we've gotten all the paint off. We've got the tip of it roughed up a little bit so we have a nice surface for the epoxy to bond to. We'll go ahead, slide this shaft in, see if it goes all the way in. That's looking pretty good. Of course, it's only going to go so far because I've got this tape on here still. So I'll go ahead, take the tape off just to ensure that it's going to sit all the way down. You want to make sure when you install the shaft that it goes all the way down to the base of the hosel. You don't want there to be any space there. All right, so let's slide this on. That looks pretty darn good. Give it a little tap on the ground to make sure it's set all the way. Perfect. Okay, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and measure this to final length and cut the shaft. So let's get our ruler out. Put this on here. Of course, right now with the shaft in its raw form, it's going to be way too long. I'm actually going to reuse this tape that I just used at the tip end. I'm going to have this shaft, this golf club play at, see if you can see this, 44.5 inches. As we've talked about before, whenever we're measuring golf clubs, you want to make sure and you leave a 1/4 inch short of whatever your final length is going to be, because once you put that grip on, that's going to add that extra 1/4 inch. Let me get a marker. So let's make sure we have this right up against the bottom of this, at touching the bottom. That looks good right there. And we're going to go ahead and put a mark on this at 44.25 inches. Okay, let's go ahead and cut this. I can now remove the head. You don't want to leave the head on there while you're cutting it because it's not glued in and it'll just fall off. And then you'll have a big ding or scratch on the head. Okay, we've gone ahead, cut that shaft. Again, always wearing safety glasses. And I cut, as you can see, right through the tape. So we have a nice clean cut. We don't have any frayed graphite fibers sticking out. Take that out of the vise, take the vise clamp off, and now we can take this tape off. Okay, next step, we're going to go ahead and get a swing weight for it. Basically get an estimate of what this is going to weigh when it's all put together. So we'll go ahead, put the head onto the shaft, make sure it's all the way down. I'm going to put this in the swing weight scale. We got to remember, without the grip on it, we kind of have to hang it off the end just a bit. And we are going to have to attach the grip to it. So I'm going to get a little piece of fishing line because it's lightweight and won't throw off any of our measurements. And we're basically going to tie this grip onto the end of this just to get an idea. Okay. This is basically balanced on here. I'm going to put the grip as far to the end as I can and get the tip of the butt end of the shaft right to the very end of the scale so it's like it would have the grip on it. And let's go ahead and get a measurement here. And we're looking like about D2. Okay, let's go ahead and mix up some epoxy and assemble this golf club. We can go ahead, put the grip aside for now. We're not going to use that until the very end. We're going to need the head and the shaft. Now this particular head is a driver with an adjustable hosel, a movable hosel. I'm going to go ahead and take the hosel out of the driver head so I can just work on the epoxy, the shaft, and the adapter without the head getting in the way, possibly getting epoxy on it, getting it dirty or anything. Here's our hosel. One other word about these hosels. If we're working with an adjustable hosel and we're not using the head, you want to make sure that you put the shaft in and install it whatever direction you're going to want it based on your hosel settings. So if you have your hosel set at 9.5 degrees, make sure you position your shaft accordingly so when it's in the club, the logos are set the way you want them to look. If you set it to 11.5 degrees, but then play the club at 9.5 degrees, all of a sudden your logos are going to be off of center. Some people will find that annoying. Some people won't care. But in general, you want to be focusing on whatever loft and lie setting you plan on using. It's good to go ahead and install the shaft that way, at least to start with. You may change it later, but at least to start with, it'll look nice, clean, and finished. All right, let's go ahead and mix up some epoxy. I'm going to use some 2-part 24-hour epoxy today. This is 1-to-1 24-hour epoxy, basically equal parts of these two. I've got these little mixing cups that have graduation marks on it so you can see how much you're putting in. So let's go ahead and mix this, just like we've done previously when we were doing our shaft extending video. We want to mix this for at least a minute. The only time you can really get in trouble with epoxy is if you haven't prepped your pieces correctly, that being the hosels aren't clean or the shafts aren't prepped to get the paint or the chrome off and you don't have a good surface for the epoxy to bond to, or if the epoxy hasn't been mixed thoroughly enough and it might not hold to the same tensile strength. So go ahead, mix it for a good 60 seconds at least, get it good and mixed up. You'll have good uniform colors, what you're looking for. This one that I'm using today is actually, one of the 2 parts is black, so it's going to be harder to tell just based on color because it just all turns black. So again, 60 seconds, mix it up, and then we'll put it on. We've been mixing it for over a minute, so it's good and thoroughly mixed. Okay, now let's assemble this. Before I go ahead and start assembling, I'm going to grab 2 more things. One, I'm going to go ahead and grab a paper towel, and I'm going to grab just a little bit of grip solvent, put that on here. Again, after we put the shaft into the adapter, a little bit of that epoxy is going to ooze out of the end, and we want to clean that up just to make it look nice and not have epoxy drips all over the shaft and all over the head, which never looks like a good clean job. So in order to help us do that, a little bit of grip solvent, just a tiny bit, on a paper towel, to wipe away the excess epoxy. Makes it nice, clean. You don't have to worry about the grip solvent and the epoxy interacting. Just use just a tiny bit, that's all you need. Okay, so let's assemble this club. We're first gonna take the epoxy and put it inside the adapter. Again, like we talked about in our video on extending a golf club when we were epoxying in the shaft extension, you don't want to use too much epoxy. You just want to use enough to coat all the surfaces. That being all the surfaces inside the adapter, inside the hosel. Just get everything with a nice light coating. Okay? Then you set that down. Now we're going to do the shaft. Again, same thing. Don't use too much epoxy. Just want to coat the surfaces that's going to be going into the hosel. The problem with using too much epoxy is either one, it'll all just ooze back out and make a mess, or two, it can go and ooze up inside the shaft, which is not what you would want. So ideally just enough epoxy just to coat it. So I've got it coating the whole thing. In fact, now I'm basically trying to scrape off the excess. So there's just enough coating it. Okay, here we go, assembly. Make sure, again, like I said, I know where I'm gonna want this shaft and logo to line up. I'm gonna have it on the 9.5 degree setting, so I'm gonna go ahead and put my logo facing the same direction as the 9.5 degree, meaning the logo will be down on the finished golf club. We're gonna go ahead, I'm gonna do this so you can see it on this camera. Slide the shaft into the adapter. As we're inserting it, we're rotating it, turning it, keep turning it till it goes all the way in and sets at the bottom, just like that. Good. Once it's all the way in there, I like to give it one more full rotation. Let me find my loft setting on here that I know I want. Okay, there's my loft setting. Now let me get my logo the same way. Okay, there's my logo. That looks good. Logo is going to be perfectly lined up with this 9.5 degrees. Okay, I'm going to give this just a little tap on the ground. I'm using this block of wood because I don't have the actual head on it, just to make sure it's set in there fully. Okay, now that this is in here, you always want to support it by either the club head or in this case the adapter. Don't carry it around by the shaft because it can start to fall off. I'm going to go ahead, put that tiny bit of solvent on the paper towel. I'm going to give it just a minute just to sort of soak in, and then just kind of work my way around and get that excess epoxy wiped off. We've cleaned up all the excess epoxy. Make sure our logos haven't shifted around at all. There's my 9.5 degrees. There's my logo. That still seems to be in the right position. So now we'll just go bring this over here. Again, setting it down, holding it by the adapter, and just let it dry, just like that. Like we've talked about before, do not throw away your mixing cup or whatever you use to mix your epoxy. Go ahead, put it right there next to whatever work you just did with it. That way, when it's dry, when this is hard and this little stick isn't able to move around, you know you can start messing around with the clubs. Otherwise, you've got no way of knowing unless you pick them up and start twisting them, in which case you've broken the epoxy bond and you're gonna have to start over. So keep this. This is your gauge to know when that epoxy is done. Well, that's basically it. This is 24-hour epoxy, so the epoxy is gonna take overnight to cure. Come back tomorrow, the club will be solidly attached. Then you just have to put the grip on like we've done before, just the grip tape and the solvent, slide the grip on. 20 minutes after that, it's ready to go hit. That's basically the whole process. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please go down below, like it, send it to a friend, or subscribe to our channel. As always, we'll be putting out more videos with more ideas and tips and tricks. Until next time, keep it in the short grass.